Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Milos Majore, and I will be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftusness, Jared Jeter, and Sebastian Ditgen about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor that we publish every Friday alongside this podcast. Today, we're going to be starting off with a brief roundup of all of our major developments happening in each of the hotspots we regularly cover, which as a reminder are the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And then we'll take a quick look at some of the developments out of Canada and Cuba. And then following that, we'll have a discussion on China's relations with the United States and Russia, the state of transatlantic relations, as well as a quick look at the Ebola outbreak in the DRC. So with that in mind, let's jump into our roundup. Andrew, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so in the Middle East this week, we saw a trend towards the diplomatic de-escalation scenario, specifically with Iran saying that it is currently reviewing the latest peace proposal from the United States. Trump, meanwhile, said that he is delaying planned strikes. Reportedly, they had been delayed a matter of hours before they were supposed to be carried out against Iran, and he said that he's willing to wait, quote, a few days for the right answers from Iran, and that is the latest. At the time of recording, there has not been an official response yet from the Iranians. Meanwhile, Pakistan recently deployed at least 8,000 troops and 16 aircraft to Saudi Arabia. They have a mutual defense treaty with the Saudis. This is especially interesting, though, because Pakistan, of course, is playing the key mediation role between the United States and the Iranians. Now, both Saudi and the UAE have reported numerous incidents of drone incursions, drone attacks, I should say, into their territory. From what I've seen, at least the Emiratis have not definitively attributed these attacks to Iran, although you of course can read in between the lines there. Now, one strike in particular landed at an Emirati nuclear energy facility, causing a fire. Looking now outside of the Gulf, in the Levant, the number of Lebanese people killed by Israeli strikes in the ongoing war has surpassed 3,000 as of May 19. Israeli forces continue an aggressive bombing campaign, primarily for now, at least in the south and in the east of the country. And there is ground fighting continuing essentially on a daily basis between Israeli soldiers and Hezbollah. Some interesting reporting on the status of Israeli occupations in the Middle East. Israel has extended its occupation of Gaza from approximately 53% of the territory to 60% since the ceasefire deal has gone into place between Israel and Hamas, and that is coming from Netanyahu himself. There's also been some very interesting reporting from the Financial Times saying that since the October 7th attacks, Israel has expanded its occupations in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria for a total of 1,000 square kilometers. Now, turning to Europe and looking at the Russia-Ukraine war, we saw a trend toward the hybrid escalation scenario, specifically as it relates to transatlantic relations and tension between the United States and NATO. The Trump administration plans to formally reduce the number of forces and capabilities that it would commit to any sort of security crisis in Europe. Think of an Article 5 scenario. Russia and Belarus have started joint military exercises in Belarusian territory. Now, we see that from time to time. What stands out here, though, is that the Belarusian Defense Ministry is saying that Russia has moved nuclear warheads into their territory as part of these exercises. And in other news, Latvia has scrambled jets for the last 3 consecutive days, responding to drone incursions into its airspace, reportedly from Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has said that Russia is preparing a, quote, appropriate response after Russian intelligence services have indicated that Ukraine And again, this is a statement from Russian officials that Ukraine is planning to utilize Latvian territory to launch drone strikes into Russian territory. The Ukrainians, of course, say that this is false. And then looking now, interesting crossover with Russia and China. There's been some reporting this week that surfaced saying that the Chinese military has trained approximately 200 Russian forces last year in drone operations as part of a covert program. And then some of those Russian soldiers, of course, then deployed and used those drone capabilities in Ukraine. And it should be said that the Russians, for their part, deny this.
Thank you, Andrew. Turning now to you, Jared, for some updates from the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks, Milos. Yeah, in the Indo-Pacific, we've been seeing relative status quo being maintained following the Trump-Xi summit that we saw last week. During the summit, China confirmed that it would establish a bilateral board of trade, which would increase purchasing from the United States, although it has also decided to ban the import of gaming chips from NVIDIA. Trump also stated that he would be discussing an arms sale with Taiwan, while China is holding off a meeting with the Pentagon officials as it receives more clarity from the Taiwan arms sales agreement. Russian President Vladimir Putin has visited Beijing this week. While both countries reiterated their ties, China did not end up signing any new energy cooperation agreements. Chinese shipments of rare earth elements to Japan rose slightly in April, although industry leaders have warned of short supplies if the restrictions continue. President Xi is reportedly planning to visit North Korea as early as next week, with Kim Jong-un calling the reinforcements along the southern border.
Thank you both. And now turning to you, Sebastian, could you give us a few updates of some of the other hotspots that we've been keeping an eye on this week?
Yes, thanks, Milos. So, U.S.-Canada relations have escalated in a hybrid escalation this week as the Undersecretary of Defense, Albert Colby, announced on an X post that the U.S. will pause its participation on the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, which is a bilateral cooperation board with Canada. And this is because, as cited, there's been insufficient progress from Canada to meet its defense requirements. This board was established in 1940, and it brought around things such as the creation of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. The Canadian PM, Mark Carney, he previously vowed to raise the country's defense spending to 2%, but this has been deemed insufficient by the U.S. Moving on to Cuba, which has been a hybrid escalation as well this week. The U.S. has charged former Cuban President Raul Castro with conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals in 1996 following the downing of 2 planes en route to Florida from the island back then. This comes as Washington has been applying increased pressure against Cuba to provide meaningful changes to its governance structure. Current Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel accused the U.S. of charging Castro without any legal foundation as a political maneuver. On the other hand, Russia released a statement vowing to provide continued support for Cuba.
Great, thank you all for those roundups. Let's turn now to our discussion part of the show. So there's been a lot happening this week, as always. I think this week in particular, we've seen China kind of leveraging its status as a reception of other world leaders, namely the United States, which we talked about last week, but also Russian President Vladimir Putin, as all of you mentioned up top. Who's got thoughts on how this went this week?
Yeah, so the situation between Russia and China is a lot more nuanced and interesting than a lot of people give it credit for. Because Russia and China often operate in an adversarial or competitive capacity with the United States, many people assume that they are in lockstep, both their motivations and their intentions. However, the actual situation between them is a little bit more fraught than a lot of people give it credit for. The situation with Russia ever since the beginning of the war in Ukraine is that they have seen continuous oil shipment reductions from the European purchasers. This has really put a heavy strain on their economy, and as such, they've had to make up for the shortfall by rapidly exporting increased amount of oil to places like China, principally, at a massively reduced rate. This has put Russia in a situation where they are very economically dependent on China, and where, as long as the war in Ukraine is going on, and as long as their relationship with the rest of Europe remains incredibly tense, they're not really able or in a position where they can really refuse China economically in a lot of ways. As such, the reiteration of their trade ties that we've been seeing in this recent summit is sort of a reaffirmation that China is continuing to hold a lot of economic power over Russia, and that Russia views China, while it views it as a benefit right now. China and Russia have historically often been competitors, both territorially and economically, while Russia definitely views China as very helpful and very necessary for its continued economic survival at the moment. Russia absolutely views China as more of a potential competitor in the future, as China's power continues to grow in the Far East relative to Russia's own power. So now we're going to be seeing a situation where China is very economically influential over Russia, and where Russia, needing that influence, tolerates China's presence and tolerates China's influence over its economy. But Russia will absolutely be looking to assert its own nationalist objectives later down the line, hopefully to be able to kind of get out of China's thumb a little.
Yeah, and you mentioned up top that one of the things that we saw, I mean, first of all, just visually speaking, it was interesting to see the summit looked quasi identical to last week's summit with Trump in terms of the reception of the president and the kind of military salutations that the Chinese had prepared. But you mentioned up top that, one of the things that we saw or didn't see from the summit was a lack from China, a lack of will to sign off on any energy cooperation agreements. What are your thoughts on that?
So my main thoughts on that is that China predominantly did not sign off on any new agreements because it doesn't have to. China is the one really holding the economic cards right now. And right now, China is importing Russian oil at a massively reduced rate. Russia needs this income, and they don't really have any other major buyers that can buy at a similar industrial scale. So they basically have to take what China offers them. So China doesn't really need to incorporate any new energy agreements right now because they're the ones holding most of the cards. Now, in the future, that might change, particularly with the potential cessation of a Ukrainian war, as we've been hearing whispers about. But generally speaking, China is pretty happy with the overall status quo between itself and Russia, and it does not see a need to really change that because they're the ones principally benefiting in their own national interest.
Do you think that they might change that, though, if the Iran war continues to drag on and oil shipments from Iran aren't as readily available for China?
That's definitely been a big problem for China, particularly in the south, where they're further away from readily available Russian oil reserves. And if the situation continues to deteriorate, then China might start to change its tune. China, though, does have a very well-established oil reserve system. It's been pretty well cataloged that they have a pretty solid reserve. However, no reserve can last forever. So if the reserve is able to kind of maintain itself until a potential cessation of the war in Iran, then China pretty much comes out the winner. However, if they start to run low on this reserve or even run out, then they're going to have to start revisiting their relationship with Russia, and it might give Russia a potential benefit in a future negotiation. But right now, China's kind of running out the clock to see if it can maintain its level of control over Russia without needing to renegotiate.
Andrew, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, Jared, do you have any idea how far away China is right now from having to tap into those reserves? Or let's say if tonight, and this could happen, the war in Iran resumed like very intense offensive operations from the U.S. and Israel. How stressful do you think that would be to Beijing, specifically in terms of, I don't want to say maintaining the status quo, but I mean...
So generally speaking, China is trying to kind of play the gamble right now. They're keeping their reserves tightly locked up so that they can, use them as the oil revenue starts, or the oil supplies start to dry up from Iran. And they're waiting to see if a peace treaty will be signed between the U.S. and Iran. But if that doesn't happen, they're going to have to dig deeper into the reserves. We've already started to see some warning signs of oil rationing from China. And if they have to dig into their reserves, it can last them a while, just like the American reserves lasted them a little bit. But while China does have a very well-developed oil reserve system, it's a reserve. Nothing is invincible. So they're only going to be able to do it for so long. And if China starts, and of course, nobody knows exactly how big it is. That's a very well-kept state secret. However, if China starts to dig into it, they're only going to be able to do it for so long before they have to start renegotiating with Russia, which is probably the reason why Putin did not really push too hard or make too big of a deal out of a lack of energy requirements, because both leaders are kind of playing a sort of game of chicken, waiting to see if the war in Iran will continue to a point where China will be given an advantage or if Russia will be given an advantage. Right now, Russia is kind of pining for the war to go on a little bit longer so they can get that better negotiation point.
Yeah, and it should be said that in the aftermath of the Trump-Xi meeting, we didn't really see any big developments with regards to the war, right? I mean, there was a general sense that that was something the US would push China to help out on. Getting China to pressure Iran into conceding to some of the US's demands, but ultimately we didn't see much of that other than a general agreement from China that Iran shouldn't obtain a nuclear weapon. Andrew, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned up top this increased collaboration between Russia and China on the military front. What's your sense on how significant that is, and do you think it will have any impact on the European conflict side of things?
Well, I think the right question here is, the headline was basically China trains Russian drone operators, right? The Kremlin denies it, never believe anything until the Kremlin denies it, right? But let's just say that is the case. Well, why isn't it the other way around? Why aren't Russians training Chinese drone operators, right? We look at Ukraine. Not only are they exporting technical capability and expertise to the Middle East right now, to essentially every state in the Gulf in very high demand, right? But they're also deepening their industrial ties in the defense sector with essentially all of their allies in Europe, right? I just think I think that's more of an interesting question at this point in the war than why isn't the situation reversed between the Russians and the Chinese? Jared.
Yeah, I wanted to get your take on something, Andrew. Do you believe that China and Russia are training these drone operators out of a necessity? Like, is this being done because Russia has lost so many of its own personnel that it absolutely needs this training? Or is this being done as a way of being able to deepen security ties? And Russia doesn't particularly need this, but this is a good way to deepen relations. Like, is this being done out of necessity or just diplomatic convenience?
I think diplomatic convenience, right? From the perspective of the Chinese. And, we see we see the Russians doing that with the Iranians too, right? Not so much during this, maybe during this current conflict, but in the aftermath or the diplomatic fallout, we can say, of the last joint U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign in Iran back in, well, I guess a year ago now, back in last May, right? We saw, well, for one thing, the Iranians were, for the first time, at least that I can remember, publicly extremely unhappy with the status quo of their relationship with the Russians, right? And very senior Iranian officials let that be known. And I think we saw a number of face-saving maneuvers from the Russians. And I think, I wouldn't call this face-saving right now between Russia and China, but I think that's closer to what's going on there.
Yeah, and it should be said that, so this news was referring to, the personnel being trained actually last year in 2025, right? So it's already, these are details emerging from something that happened covertly, a couple of months ago at least. And we've covered before on the show how we've also seen the reverse, right? Where Russian paratroopers, I believe it was, were training their Chinese counterparts on potential operations against Taiwan. So clearly that no limits partnership between China and Russia does have some sway in terms of at least symbolic security assistance in the training domain.
I think there might be some limits on the effectiveness of that training, but your point is well taken.
Yes, definitely. And we've seen, as we've mentioned before, there clearly is some degree of limits, given that China is not necessarily always willing to just acquiesce to Russia's demands, especially on the energy front. So point well taken as well. And just to round out the topic of China, wanted to get your take, Jared. In terms of the arms sales to Taiwan, this was something that the US said it would talk about with China. It was something that had previously been delayed. I know that there's currently a $14 billion arms package that is awaiting confirmation. What's your sense on what's going on with that?
So the U.S. arms sales to Taiwan have always been a contentious issue. The way that they talked about it in the summit itself was actually relatively muted. Like, there was not too much really substantive change in the way that these countries usually talk about this particular contentious topic. Inside Taiwan itself is actually where a lot of the more interesting aspects of this are starting to manifest, because the type of lukewarm way that Trump was talking about this with Xi has led some to believe that he is developing a more apathetic tone toward Taiwan. And while He did not in any way indicate that the U.S. policy toward Taiwan will be changing. We've already started to see uh, the rumblings of the internal political effects this is going to have in Taiwan. This definitely supports the KMT narrative that the United States is an unreliable partner and therefore that they should be more cooperative with China. As far as how this is actually going to affect the arms sale itself, it's not really clear or evident. I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that what went on in the summit is in any way going to affect these arms sales. I would actually say that the status of these arms sales is going to be a lot more contingent on whether or not the LY, the Legislative Yuan in Taiwan, is going to approve everything. They recently approved a large scale spending package. However, individual arms packages they have to be negotiated on a case by case basis, and it takes a very long time. There's been a lot of internal fighting about this, particularly because the Taiwanese government is a split government right now. The legislature is controlled by the opposition. So we're probably going to be seeing continued fighting about that within Taiwan before we really see if the arms sales go through in the timeline that they're planned to. Uh, as far as China's response to this goes, I wouldn't say that this is anything that breaks the status quo. China has constantly, for many years now, been critical of American arms sales to Taiwan. However, the language on this from Beijing has not really deviated at all from this summit.
Gotcha. So yeah, pretty much business as usual. I suspect that I know that from the Taiwanese side they're going to be angling for talks with Trump, so we'll definitely hear more about that, I assume, in the coming weeks. But I'm sure that China's definitely enjoying being the center of attention, be it with the United States and Russia overall.
Yeah, actually, it's really funny you bring that up. It was just this morning that it was announced that President Trump will be having a direct call with President Lai, which is actually pretty unusual between U.S. and Taiwanese leaders.
Well, there you go. So hopefully we'll hear more about that next week. I wanted to turn now, before we close off, to you, Sebastian, as our resident lead analyst on all things in the African continent. So there's been a lot of international concern, obviously, with this Ebola outbreak happening in Eastern Congo and in Uganda. What's your sense on what's going on there and what kind of repercussions we might be seeing in the weeks to come?
Yeah, so this case of Ebola, it started in Eastern DRC around maybe April, maybe earlier. And that's the concerning thing because it was only detected, the first case was detected on May 8th. Now, this gave the disease a lot of time to spread around the local communities. There was not much reporting and there's not much development in terms of health and health aid going into this region. It's in the Ituri province, which is in the northeast corner of the country, an area that is bordering Uganda, but is also very isolated geographically from both other countries and also the rest of the DRC. As a result, it spread, and now there's over 100 confirmed cases, over 500 unconfirmed cases. There could be more. One patient was found in Kampala who was positive for Ebola, and currently the WHO has declared this a crisis, and some countries have delivered some aid. The US has delivered $25 million, and some other countries like the UK have delivered similar amounts. Now, this is not to be concerned for like a pandemic, and I think there's important distinctions. Ebola is spread first from animals, is zoonotic through suspected fruit bats or perhaps antelope, and is spread through saliva, spit, other bodily fluids, and can be lingering on clothes like that, but it's not airborne. Now, some other things to keep in mind is really the concern for the lack of reporting and the lack of information spread and health access. And it's also a security threat. In the same province, Ituri, there was an attack by a local militia called Codeco around April, and this killed 92 civilians in the area. And this was unreported outside of the village in which it happened for over 20 days before it was finally picked up on May 10th by the international community. So this delay in security assistance, but also health in this case, is a major concern in a region that's already fraught with civil war and conflict through different means for decades now. So it's just an added layer to this. MONUSCO, the mission from the UN to the Congo, did not pick up on the disease. It also did not pick up on the attack in April. And these are examples of delayed development response, especially on the heels of the cuts of USAID from the US side in 2025, as well as leaving the WHO.
Okay, so there have been, as you mentioned, issues with detecting it initially, but it's been detected now, and as you mentioned, aid is coming in. So what's your sense on whether or not it's going to be getting worse or possibly better? Is this something that neighboring countries especially should be concerned about?
I think all countries in the region should be especially on guard. However, this is not something that would spill into a pandemic. This is not the first time Ebola has had an outbreak in this region. There's been 17 outbreaks of Ebola in the DRC. The two previous ones in this province have had around a 30% mortality rate, and Ebola is extremely deadly. It kills at a very fast rate, but that also limits the spread of the disease. So it's a little bit harder for it to catch on with wider populations due to its sheer devastation that it causes on those who get it. So for that reason, it's not going to be found like way outside the region, but people in Uganda, people in South Sudan, which borders Ituri province, and also others in the DRC and surrounding areas should definitely be have heightened vigilance for sure.
And you mentioned the intersection there with the Codeco attack. What can you tell us on the group itself? Are they usually very active in the area?
Yes, so the Codeco is a military group that supports the Hima group in this region, in the Ituri region. The Hima and Lemba have been at conflict for several decades now. These are both ethnic groups that share land and have kind of disputes over territory, cultural practices, and politics, governance in the region. So this is a continuation of a long-standing conflict, but one that in the past has been met with a response from, say, the mission from the UN, MONUSCO, or other bodies. But in this case, it was an example where there was no response at all, and not even knowledge of it.
Well, good that you've got your eye on it, and we'll undoubtedly be coming back to it in the weeks to come if the situation doesn't alleviate. So with that, we'll have to wrap it up for today. And as a reminder to our listeners, as always, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to all the topics we talked about today, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Andrew, Sebastian, and Jared. Thank you all for listening.